Hello, Patriots, segment 227 today, titling this one The Situation in Iran Isn't About Israel or Oil, as a lot of people, including the pundits that are pushing that bullshit narrative, would have you believe. For all of you out there, the Iran situation, again, it is not a war. Some are now nervous because Lindsey, the warmonger, Gramnesty is out there. He was out there yesterday, and he had to say it. He just couldn't help himself. He suggested that we put troops on the ground, and of course, everybody is up in arms now, figuratively. It it stands to reason why he'd say something like that because Gramnesty, he makes money off wars. That's why he's considered a warmonger, and if he can actually turn this into a war, all the better for him because he lines his pockets. Now, President Trump is not going to put troops on the ground. He has said he's not, and he's always said that he's not going to do that. And as I've stated in another video, there is the possibility, we do not know, because most of their missions are classified. There's a possibility that there are special forces on the ground there, and maybe even some combat controllers directing missile traffic. Not necessarily needed in this day and age, but the Marines and the Army, the foot soldiers, they're never going to set foot in Iran. So everybody needs to calm down about that. I did read an article from Revolver News that was suggested to me. And not only are we taking down Iran because they are a terrorist threat to this country and the rest of the world in general, as you know, but and I didn't realize this, but here's the other piece of the pie that people don't realize. But apparently President Trump sure as hell does. So I'm going to read you the article. It's a little lengthy. I apologize for that. But it's something that I want to share with you that I think is important. So the article reads, right now the internet is packed with people insisting this Iran war is about oil, Israel, or Trump supposedly blundering into another Iraq-style disaster. That's the laziest possible read of what's happening. What we're actually watching is a direct hit on the globalist power structure that has been steering and controlling Western foreign policy for decades. Iran is the flashpoint, but it's not the whole story. Not by a long shot. The real fight is over the old transatlantic system that spent years using American blood, American money, and American power to keep its geopolitical machine running. Let's get into it. The first thing you need to understand is where all the panic is coming from. The meltdown after the Iran strike didn't come from people who oppose war on principle. It came from the same foreign policy crowd that spent the last 30 years cheering on regime change, proxy wars, and endless stabilization missions. These people have never had a problem with bombs falling. They love bombs. What they can't stand is when they're not the ones running the operation. And even more than that, they can see the bigger picture of what President Trump is actually doing here. They know what this move means, and that's why they're scared. Trump didn't follow their script. He didn't wait for usual approval from the transatlantic club, and he didn't treat Britain and Europe like co-managers of the whole affair. That's why the reaction was so loud and so fast. Not because war suddenly shocked them, but because the globalist system they've relied on for decades to manage and control these conflicts and the world itself is being dismantled in real time and slipping right out of their hands. And this is exactly why all the hot takes about oil and Israel miss the point so badly. Of course, oil matters. Of course, Israel has its own agenda. And yes, regional security matters. But those are surface level explanations. The deeper story is that Trump is taking a swing at the old global management system itself, especially the British centered financial and strategic network that has quietly shaped Western policy for decades. That's why the reaction has been so frantic and theatrical. The people melting down right now aren't scared of war. They're scared of what President Trump is doing to the system they've controlled for decades. And that's where the real story begins. Not with the missiles, but with what the strike revealed. The moment Iran was hit, the mask was blown off. Britain was sidelined. Europe was left issuing statements from the hallway. The neocons started whining that Trump wasn't handling regime change correctly. In other words, the people who usually act like they run the world suddenly looked like they were reading about events after the fact, just like everyone else. And that right there is the biggest tell and the starting point for what I, the creator of this story, I'm about to walk you through. President Trump is shifting power in real time. He's icing out the Brits and much of Europe and moving the pieces around on the global board. And when this is all said and done, the world and the United States right along with it will be operating very differently. Things are going to look very different once the globalists are truly sidelined. Pay attention to what the old school neocons are actually complaining about. It's not that the strike happened. Many of these same people have been pushing for military action against Iran for years. The real problem is that Trump didn't run it through the system they spent decades building and protecting. The usual playbook was not followed. No carefully managed regime change rollout, no approved opposition figures, no prearranged international coalition, none of the machinery they used to steer wars and control the globe was used. And that machinery matters more than most Americans realize, because for decades the global war machine hasn't actually operated the way people think it does. The public story is that Washington leads and everyone else follows. The real story is that a network of globalist deep state groups have been running the show, as we all know. It consists of intelligence networks, financial interests, and old imperial alliances that have quietly been running the table behind the scenes. And sitting at the center of that global deep state system has been Britain. That's the part almost nobody talks about. London's power isn't about raw military strength anymore. It's about influence, finance, and intelligence networks. Not to mention a slew of think tanks and diplomatic channels. These quiet mechanisms have been shaping world and U.S. policy without most Americans even realizing it. For decades, that system worked because the United States supplied the muscle, while the much larger transatlantic establishment helped steer where the muscle was pointed. For decades, we've been the guns for hire, carrying out agendas cooked up in posh meeting rooms inside London's financial world. But the moment the Iran operation began, something changed. Britain and much of Europe weren't leading the response. They weren't coordinating the strategy or making sure the usual power players stayed in line. They weren't even in the decision loop. Once Trump hit Iran, one of the first people to start screeching was John Bolton. And I have to stop there for a second and ask, why is he even screeching? Was he not indicted? Did the FBI not come and raid his home? Why is he still out making these claims and these statements? He shouldn't even be a player right now. Anyway, once Trump hit Iran, one of the first people to start screeching was John Bolton, a longtime warmonger who has never met a war he didn't love. So I'm going to play a video. This is Susan Kokinda. She's an author and organizer with Promethean Action who has spent decades studying the economic and geopolitical power structures that operate behind the scenes of global politics. What she's about to explain is more detail is why the reaction to the Iran strike has been so frantic. So let me play that video for you.
The man who has wanted to bomb Iran for 30 years suddenly sound the alarm about the president who finally did it. Politico's headline read, "John Bolton sounds the alarm on Trump's Iran gamble." And here's what Bolton told News Nation.
We can't get a completely straight answer from the president what his objective is. He says, with one set of remarks, it's regime change. And that, by the way, is my preferred objective. I'm entirely in favor of it. But then says in other remarks that this could be over with in a couple days. If this turns into a one and done operation, 2, 3, 4 days of strikes, and then President Trump says, okay, opposition, over to you, there's not going to be regime change.
Bolton's complaint was echoed across the British press and the foreign policy establishment. It's that the president is not on board with their policy of regime change. Chatham House, the intellectual arm of the British Foreign Office, chimed in saying, you don't do regime change from the air. No strategy, can't be done from the air. That was the expert consensus over the weekend. Then on Sunday, President Trump sat down with The Atlantic and said this about the Iranians. They want to talk, and I've agreed to talk, so I will be talking to them. They should have done it sooner. They waited too long. Iran's new leadership called Washington, not London, and Trump answered. Now, the left is denouncing the strike. The neocons are worried Trump won't manage it correctly, and everyone is arguing about whether it will succeed, all assuming the same thing about what success means. What none of them understand is that the president's policy is a rejection of more than 100 years of geopolitics, what's known as the Great Game. And key operatives of that great game, like former Prince Andrew, are now on the chopping block, and that is not a coincidence. I'm Susan Kokinda, and I've been tracking how British geopolitics has subverted American foreign policy for over a century.
There you go. She just summed it up right there. Bingo. I mean, I have said many times that we are only privy to a small fraction of what happens in DC or in the Oval Office for that matter. President Trump is upsetting the apple cart. He's upsetting the globalist apple cart. Not only that, but he's in the process of removing an axis of evil, empire. And the other two axes of evil, China and Russia, are being impacted greatly by what he's doing. I don't think that President Trump's advisors are advising him. I don't think that. I mean, he gets daily intel briefings of what's happening around the world, but I seriously think that his advisors, number one, don't have a clue, and number two, I don't think they're far enough on his side to be advising him on something as deep as this. I think President Trump has a great concept of what's happening in the world and in the worldview, and I think he knows it like the back of his hand. And this is another reason they, whoever they are, have been trying to remove him from the planet. I've always said that the deep state is not just the people in Congress. I stated in another video that this deep state isn't even Soros. Soros, in reality, is just a puppet of the deep state. The deep state are the globalists who manage the puppets below them. And this article here is on target. It is President Trump is taking down the globalists, and Susan said it right. For 100 years they've been managing the world, and their dominoes, their house of cards is slowly coming to an end. That's all I've got, Patriots. One last thing. If you see somebody doing this, it is the international sign for distress. Person that is doing this is in deep trouble. and they're asking you for their help, if you can safely provide them assistance, do so. You might end up saving a life. Have a good one, Patriots.